don't care who you claim to be. Those children are alone up there, and I've already called the police.
People like me?
Child Protective Services will be very interested in your parenting when they arrive. I want you to repeat that phrase like me when those officers arrive.
People like you don't belong in establishments like this. I am your supervisor. I am the board of the ownership group. I own this hotel!
The words cut through the pristine marble lobby of the Grandview Imperial Hotel like a blade through silk, sharp and unforgiving, dripping with the kind of contempt that needs no explanation. I don't care who you claim to be, Rebecca Walsh snarled, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing the air between them like a weapon, her voice rising with each syllable until it echoed off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed 1,000 moments of luxury but perhaps never one quite this ugly. Those children are alone up there, and I've already called the police. People like you don't belong in establishments like this, and Child Protective Services will be very interested in your so-called parenting when they arrive. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes, heavy, pregnant with something massive about to shift. Then came the response, delivered with the precision of a master chess player who's been 3 moves ahead the entire game, calm as still water but carrying an undertow that could drown empires. People like me? The black woman standing before Rebecca repeated the phrase slowly, tasting each word as if examining a wine that had gone catastrophically bad. I want you to repeat that phrase, people like me, when those officers arrive. Better yet, I want you to repeat it to your supervisor. Oh, but wait. A pause, deliberate and devastating. I am your supervisor. I am the board. I am the ownership group. I own this hotel, every marble tile you're standing on, every chandelier hanging above your head, every paycheck you've collected for the past 6 weeks, including the one you won't be receiving next month. The color drained from Rebecca Walsh's face like water from a broken dam, but our story, this story of assumptions, power, prejudice, and the price of underestimating those you've decided don't belong, this story is just beginning. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further. To understand how we arrived at this moment of reckoning in the lobby of one of coastal Connecticut's most exclusive hotels, we need to rewind the clock by exactly 43 minutes, to when the autumn sun was still painting golden rectangles across the penthouse suite on the 23rd floor, and when Deandra Laurent was simply being a mother navigating the complicated choreography of co-parenting with an ex-husband she still respected, even if their marriage hadn't survived the brutal hours and relentless ambition that had built her empire. Deandra Laurent, at 42 years old, carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from privilege but from having climbed every rung of a ladder that other people kept trying to kick out from under her feet. She had the elegant bone structure that photographers loved, natural hair she wore in meticulously maintained locks that fell past her shoulders, and a wardrobe that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Today, a cashmere sweater in deep burgundy, tailored black slacks, and simple diamond studs that cost more than most people's cars but looked understated enough that you'd never guess their value unless you knew what to look for. This particular Thursday afternoon found her in that peculiar space that successful parents know well, the 10-minute window between conference calls where you try to be fully present for your children while your mind is still halfway in the boardroom. Her penthouse suite at the Grandview Imperial wasn't just accommodation. It was home, had been for the past 3 months while she quietly orchestrated the transition of ownership for the hotel she'd purchased through a labyrinth of LLCs and holding companies, keeping her identity as the new owner carefully concealed while she observed, evaluated, and took meticulous notes on every aspect of the operation she now controlled. The suite itself was a masterpiece of understated luxury, 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic, a kitchen that would make professional chefs weep with envy, and enough space that 4 children ranging from 8 to 18 years old didn't feel like they were living in each other's pockets. Skylark, her eldest at 18, was sprawled across the leather sofa with her laptop, working on college application essays for schools that had already begun courting her with scholarship offers. Temperance, 16 and sharply intelligent in the way that sometimes made adults uncomfortable, sat at the dining table surrounded by AP chemistry homework, her natural hair pulled back in a puff, occasionally calling out answers to her own questions in that way teenagers do when they're thinking out loud. The boys, Quentin at 13, all long limbs and basketball dreams, and little August at 8, still young enough to believe the world was mostly good, were engaged in an elaborate video game campaign that involved considerable shouting about strategy and betrayal. It was, in other words, a completely normal afternoon in a family that happened to be wealthy and black and living in a space that some people had already decided they didn't belong in, though Deandra wouldn't learn about those quiet complaints and raised eyebrows until much later, when the investigation revealed just how deep Rebecca Walsh's prejudice ran. when her phone buzzed with a text from Thaddeus, her ex-husband, a pediatric surgeon whose dedication to saving children's lives had ultimately consumed the marriage but never his commitment to their four. Deandra glanced at the message and felt the familiar tug of coordinating schedules. He was downstairs, had driven up from New Haven between surgeries to discuss switching weekends because of a medical conference in Boston, and rather than have him come up and interrupt the children's afternoon routine, she made the decision that would set everything in motion. "Skylark, I'm going downstairs for 15 minutes to talk to your father about scheduling," she called out, grabbing her phone and keycard. "You're in charge. If anyone needs anything." "Mom, we're fine," Skylark replied without looking up from her essay about overcoming adversity, not knowing she was about to have fresh material. "We've been home alone for years. We're not going to burn the place down in a quarter hour." "I know, baby. Just keeping you informed." Deandra kissed August's head as she passed, ruffled Quentin's hair despite his protest about his fade, and was out the door, riding the private elevator down to the lobby, completely unaware that she was being watched. Rebecca Walsh had been the general manager of the Grandview Imperial for exactly 6 weeks and 3 days, hired by the previous ownership group just before Deandra's acquisition went through, a fact that had annoyed Deandra considerably when she reviewed the personnel files and realized she'd inherited a manager she hadn't vetted. Rebecca was 47, blonde in the expensive highlighted way that required monthly maintenance, thin in the way that suggested significant gym time and possibly skipped meals, and carried herself with the particular brand of confidence that comes from spending your entire life in spaces where you were always the default, always the norm, never the question mark. She had worked her way up through luxury hospitality, or so her resume claimed, though if anyone had looked more carefully they would have noticed a pattern. She never lasted more than 2 years anywhere, always moving on just before problems could fully crystallize, always leaving behind whispers about cultural fit issues and guest complaints that were never quite serious enough to document but persistent enough to suggest a pattern. From her position at the concierge desk, Rebecca had been watching the penthouse elevator with increasing irritation for weeks now. The Laurent family, she checked the reservation multiple times, cross-referenced it with guest services, even pulled up the original booking, had been in residence for 3 months. 3 months in a hotel suite, even a residential suite, struck Rebecca as suspicious, though she couldn't quite articulate why except that it felt wrong, felt like something people did when they were running from something or hiding something or generally being the kind of guests who brought problems. And the fact that they were the only black family in a hotel that catered almost exclusively to old money, tech money, and the kind of wealth that came with trust funds and summer homes, that bothered Rebecca in a way she would never say out loud but that colored every interaction, every glance, every assumption she made. So when she saw Deandra emerge from the elevator and walk out the front entrance to meet a black man in jeans and a sweater, casual clothes, not Grandview Imperial appropriate attire in Rebecca's mental calculus, her mind immediately began constructing a narrative that confirmed every bias she'd been nursing, every complaint she'd been building in her head about guests who didn't understand our standards. The man was Thaddeus Laurent, though Rebecca didn't know that, didn't care to know that. She saw a black woman leaving a luxury hotel to meet a black man dressed casually, saw them talking with the kind of animated hand gestures that suggested either argument or intensity, and her mind filled in the blanks with assumptions that said more about her than about what was actually happening. Deandra and Thaddeus, standing by his car in the circular drive, were having the kind of conversation divorced parents have when they're trying to prioritize children over ego. A discussion about whether switching the weekend schedule would disrupt Quentin's basketball tournament, whether August was old enough to fly alone if Thaddeus wanted to take him to Boston, whether Temperance's recent mood swings were normal teenage angst or something they needed to address more seriously. It was mature, civil, even warm in the way that suggested two people who had loved each other once and still respected each other now. Inside the lobby, Rebecca was calling 911. "Yes, I need to report child abandonment at the Grandview Imperial Hotel," she said, her voice tight with a kind of righteous certainty that made the 911 operator immediately take notes. "There are 4 children, ages ranging from 8 to 18, left completely alone in a penthouse suite. The mother just left the building, I watched her go. She's been out there for over 30 minutes now. It had been 6 minutes. She met some man in the parking lot, they're just talking while those children are up there unsupervised. The youngest is 8 years old. This is a hotel, not a daycare. I don't care if the oldest is technically an adult, this is neglect. Those children need someone to check on them, and honestly, Child Protective Services should probably be involved given the pattern of behavior I've observed." The operator, trained to take such calls seriously, dispatched 2 officers and made a note to alert CPS for potential follow-up. Rebecca hung up with a sense of satisfaction, the feeling that she'd done something important, protected children from a mother who was clearly irresponsible, clearly not the kind of person who should be staying in a place like the Grandview Imperial. She didn't notice the nervous glance from Portia at the front desk, who'd been working at the hotel for 5 years and had learned to keep her head down when Rebecca went on one of her crusades. She didn't see the way Dave, the head of security, shifted uncomfortably when Rebecca loudly declared she'd called the police, his hand moving toward his radio to alert his team but hesitating because Rebecca was his boss and contradicting her had consequences. What Rebecca Walsh didn't know, what she would learn very soon in the most devastating way possible, was that the penthouse suite wasn't a hotel reservation at all. It was registered to C. Laurent Holdings LLC, which owned the entire building, which was itself a subsidiary of Laurent Hospitality Group, which was the majority shareholder in Grandview Properties International, which meant that the woman she'd just reported to police and child protective services wasn't just a guest. She was the owner of the hotel, the owner of the entire luxury property portfolio, the woman who had built an empire from a single bed and breakfast she'd purchased with money she'd saved working 3 jobs while raising 4 children alone, who'd expanded through brilliant acquisitions and meticulous management, who'd remained anonymous during this transition specifically to observe how her properties treated guests when they didn't know she was watching. And Rebecca Walsh had just failed the test spectacularly. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. If Bold Black Watch TV moved you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us amplify Black stories about justice that deserve to be heard. 14 minutes after Deandra had walked out of the building, still 3 minutes short of her promised 15, she wrapped up her conversation with Thaddeus, agreed to the weekend switch, and headed back inside, thinking about whether August would want pasta or chicken for dinner, completely unaware that her life was about to be turned inside out. The moment she walked through the revolving doors into the lobby, she knew something was wrong. There were 2 police officers standing near the concierge desk, and Rebecca Walsh was gesturing in that particular way people do when they're telling a story they believe makes them the hero, her voice carrying across the marble expanse with phrases like, completely unsupervised, and over 30 minutes, and you never know with these situations. Deandra's first thought was that something had happened in the hotel, a theft or an incident with another guest, and she began to move toward the private elevator, not wanting to get caught up in whatever drama was unfolding. But then Rebecca's voice sharpened, rising to cut across the space between them. That's her. That's the mother who left those children alone. The words stopped Deandra mid-step, confusion flooding through her system as she turned to see Rebecca pointing directly at her, the 2 officers' attention swiveling her direction, and suddenly she was the center of a scene she didn't understand, standing in the lobby of a hotel she owned while being accused of something she couldn't quite parse. I'm sorry, what? Deandra's voice was calm, professional, the tone she used in boardrooms when someone said something so absurd you weren't sure you'd heard correctly and wanted them to repeat it for the record. Officer Chin, an Asian-American woman in her mid-30s with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she'd learned to reserve judgment, stepped forward first, her hand resting near but not on her weapon, her posture open but alert. Ma'am, we received a call about 4 children left unattended in a penthouse suite. The hotel manager here says you're the mother and that you've been outside for over 30 minutes while minors are upstairs alone. The absurdity of the statement took a moment to process. Deandra glanced at her watch, she'd been gone exactly 14 minutes, and then at Rebecca, whose expression held a particular kind of smugness that made Deandra's stomach drop because she recognized it, had seen it before in 1,000 different contexts, the look of someone who decided you were a problem and was pleased to have found a way to prove it. My children are in our suite, Deandra said slowly, carefully, keeping her voice level despite the anger beginning to build behind her sternum like pressure in a sealed container. My 18-year-old daughter is supervising. I was downstairs for less than 15 minutes talking to their father about scheduling. They're not unattended, they're not in danger, they're doing homework and playing video games in their home. They're home. Rebecca's voice dripped with disbelief, with insinuation. Ms. Laurent, you've been living in a hotel penthouse for 3 months. That's not normal. That's not. Not what? Deandra interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now, the kind that made boardroom opponents reconsider their positions. Finish that sentence, Ms. Walsh. That's not normal for whom exactly? The second officer, Bradford, white, mid-40s, with a kind of weathered face that suggested years on the force and a certain weariness about human nature, stepped in before Rebecca could respond. Ma'am, we just need to verify that the children are safe. Can you provide identification and proof that you're authorized to have those children in that suite? It was a reasonable request, professionally delivered, but there was something in the way he said authorized, that made Deandra's teeth clench. She pulled out her wallet, extracted her driver's license and the platinum key card that accessed the penthouse, and handed them over, watching Officer Chin examine them while Rebecca hovered nearby, practically vibrating with certainty. "The suite is registered to C. Laurent Holdings LLC," Rebecca interjected, pulling up her tablet with guest services information. "I've never seen ownership documentation from her. For all we know, that could be a stolen key card. We've had issues with people gaining unauthorized access to executive suites before." "Have you?" Deandra asked quietly, dangerously. "Have you actually had issues with people stealing key cards to penthouse suites in the 3 months I've been living here, or are you making assumptions based on what, exactly?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Officer Chen's eyes narrowed slightly, her professional antenna picking up on something in the dynamic that wasn't quite right. She pulled out her radio, quietly requesting that security check on the children in Suite 2301, and Deandra felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her because her children were about to be disturbed, questioned, made to feel like they'd done something wrong when they'd simply been existing in their own home. "Mom?" The voice came from across the lobby, young and confused and increasingly alarmed. Skylark had come down the elevator, drawn by some sixth sense or perhaps by the security guard who'd knocked on their door to check on their welfare, and she was staring at the scene with wide eyes, her mother surrounded by police officers, guests stopping to watch, phones coming out to record, the kind of moment that would haunt them all later when they tried to sleep. "It's fine, baby," Deandra said, but her voice cracked slightly on the word fine, because it wasn't fine, nothing about this was fine. "Go back upstairs with your brothers and sister. This is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Rebecca's voice had risen to the point where the entire lobby could hear her now, where arriving guests were pausing mid-check-in to watch the drama unfold. Those children were alone for over 30 minutes. What if there'd been a fire? What if something had happened? You can't just leave children unattended in a hotel. "It's been 14 minutes. Deandra's composure finally cracked, her voice rising to match Rebecca's volume, and she immediately hated herself for it because this was what they wanted, wasn't it? For her to be loud, to be angry, to be the aggressive black woman who confirmed every stereotype they'd been nursing. "I was downstairs for 14 minutes talking to their father, who is a pediatric surgeon, about custody scheduling. My 18-year-old daughter, who is legally an adult and has been babysitting her siblings since she was 13, was supervising. There is no emergency. There is no abandonment. There is nothing happening here except you making assumptions about a family you know nothing about." Officer Chin was studying her tablet now, cross-referencing information, and something in her expression had shifted from professional neutrality to growing suspicion. But the suspicion wasn't directed at Deandra. She glanced at Rebecca, then back at her screen, then at the key card in her hand, which bore not just suite access but executive override permissions. "Ms. Walsh," Officer Chin said carefully, "the key card Ms. Laurent provided has executive override access. That's not standard guest access. Can you explain?" "Anyone can program a key card," Rebecca shot back, but there was something desperate creeping into her voice now, the first hairline crack in her certainty. "I'm telling you, I've been watching this situation for weeks. She's been here too long. It doesn't feel right. And today, I personally witnessed her leave those children alone for over. For 14 minutes, Officer Chin interrupted, her voice cool. "And the oldest child is 18, which means legally she's not required to have any supervision at all, let alone her siblings. Ms. Walsh, was there any actual evidence of danger or neglect beyond Ms. Laurent briefly leaving the building?" Rebecca's mouth opened and closed, and in that moment of hesitation, Deandra saw the whole architecture of the situation with perfect clarity. This wasn't about child safety. This had never been about child safety. This was about a black family occupying space in a building that Rebecca Walsh had decided belonged exclusively to white wealth, and when she'd seen an opportunity to challenge that presence, to assert some kind of authority over people she viewed as not belonging, she'd taken it. The rage that filled Deandra in that moment was cold and calculating, the kind that came not from heat but from permafrost, from years of navigating rooms where she wasn't wanted, from building an empire in an industry that had tried to keep her out at every turn, from raising 4 black children in a world that saw them as threats before it saw them as kids. "Call your district manager," Deandra said, her voice dropping back to that dangerous quiet. "Call Tom Reynolds right now. Tell him what you've done. Tell him you called the police on C. Laurent Holdings LLC. Tell him you threatened the owner's children with child protective services." The color that drained from Rebecca Walsh's face was so complete, so total, that for a moment she looked like a piece of paper, all the blood rushing away from the surface as her brain processed words that didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, because they would mean that everything she'd done in the last hour had just destroyed her career. What are you talking about? Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper now. I'm talking about the fact that I purchased the Grandview Imperial 8 months ago through C. Laurent Holdings LLC, along with 6 other properties in the Grandview portfolio, Deandra said, each word falling like a hammer. I've been living in the penthouse suite for 3 months specifically to observe operations, to evaluate staff, to see how this hotel treats guests when they don't know I'm watching. Tom Reynolds knows exactly who I am. The board knows exactly who I am. Every person in this building except you, apparently, knows exactly who I am. Officer Bradford's eyebrows had climbed so high they'd nearly disappeared into his hairline, and he took a subtle step back from Rebecca as if proximity to her might be contagious. Officer Chen was openly staring now, her professional mask slipping to reveal something that looked almost like pity, not for Deandra but for Rebecca, who had just made the kind of mistake that ends careers and lives on in cautionary tales. That's not possible, Rebecca stammered. I would have been told. I would have been informed if ownership changed. You were hired 3 weeks before the acquisition closed, Deandra said, pulling out her phone with hands that were remarkably steady considering the adrenaline flooding her system. By the previous ownership group. You weren't told because I specifically requested that only senior leadership and security be informed of my identity during the transition period. I wanted to see how this hotel really operated. How staff treated guests they thought had no power over them. How you, specifically, managed a diverse clientele. She pulled up her email, found the message thread with Tom Reynolds confirming her identity and the observation period, and handed the phone to Officer Chin, who read it with widening eyes and then showed it to her partner. Ms. Walsh called 911 6 minutes after I left the building, Deandra continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone presenting evidence in court, precise and devastating. She told the dispatcher I'd been gone for over 30 minutes. That's a lie. She told them my children were abandoned and unsupervised. That's a lie. She implied that I'm not fit to parent my own children, whom she's never met and knows nothing about, based solely on the fact that I stepped outside my home to have a conversation with their father. I was concerned about the children's welfare, Rebecca tried, but her voice had no strength behind it anymore. You were concerned, Deandra repeated flatly, about black children existing in a space you decided belonged exclusively to white guests. You were concerned about me living here for 3 months because you couldn't fathom that I might actually belong here, might actually own this place. You saw my skin color and my family and you made assumptions, and then you weaponized the police and the threat of CPS to try to remove us from a building that I own. Bold Black Watch TV is more than a channel, it's a community. Subscribe, like this video, and join us as we celebrate justice, truth, culture, and powerful black narratives. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of rapid footsteps crossing marble, and Tom Reynolds burst through the lobby's front entrance looking like a man who'd just received news of multiple simultaneous disasters and was trying to triage which one to address first. He was 53, silver-haired, wearing a suit that suggested he'd been in important meetings when he received whatever phone call had sent him racing across town, and his face was the color of old newspaper when he saw the scene. His new owner standing with police officers, his general manager looking like she'd just swallowed glass, and hotel guests openly recording on their phones. Ms. Laurent, Tom said, slightly breathless, and his use of her name, his tone of deference mixed with panic, confirmed everything for anyone still harboring doubts about the power dynamic that had just been revealed. I just got a call from security about, my God, what happened? What happened, Deandra said, her voice steady as stone, is that your general manager called the police on me and my children. She reported me for child abandonment because I spent 14 minutes outside talking to my ex-husband. She threatened to involve Child Protective Services. She has subjected my family to humiliation in a public space, all because she made assumptions about who belongs in this hotel. Tom Reynolds turned to Rebecca with an expression that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious, a mixture of horror and disbelief and the dawning realization that he was going to be spending the next several months in crisis management mode, dealing with lawsuits and PR disasters and angry board calls. Rebecca, he said, and his voice carried the weight of every HR nightmare he'd ever faced, did you call the police on Ms. Laurent? I didn't know who she was, Rebecca said, and there were tears in her eyes now, though whether they were from remorse or self-pity was unclear. The children were alone and she was outside for so long and I was just trying to do the right thing. 6 minutes, Officer Chin interjected, consulting her notes. According to our dispatch records, Ms. Walsh called 911 6 minutes after Ms. Laurent exited the building. She told our dispatcher it had been over 30 minutes. Ms. Walsh also failed to verify any actual danger or distress before involving law enforcement. Tom's jaw tightened, and he pulled out his own phone, fingers flying over the screen as he pulled up security footage. The lobby cameras would show everything: Deandra leaving through the front entrance, the timestamp, Rebecca watching and then immediately moving to the phone. The evidence would be irrefutable, time-stamped and archived, the kind of documentation that would matter when lawyers got involved. "How long have I been living here, Rebecca?" Deandra asked quietly. 3 months, Rebecca whispered. "And in those 3 months, have you ever seen me neglect my children? Have you ever witnessed anything that suggested they were in danger or that I was an unfit parent?" Silence. "Have you ever," Deandra continued, her voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear her, "called the police on any of the other families staying in this hotel? The Whitmore family whose 8-year-old daughter wandered down to the pool alone at 10 p.m. last month. The Castellano family whose teenager was found drinking in the hotel bar. Did you call CPS on them, Rebecca?" More silence, damning in its completeness. "No," Deandra answered her own question. "You didn't? Because they're white. Because when you saw white families engaging in actual questionable behavior, you gave them the benefit of the doubt. You assumed good intentions. You exercised discretion. But when you saw a black family simply existing in what you considered an exclusively white space, you immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions and weaponized authorities against us." Officer Bradford cleared his throat, his discomfort visible, and he glanced at his partner with an expression that suggested they both wanted to be anywhere else but here. "Ms. Laurent, I apologize for this situation. It's clear there was no actual emergency or neglect situation. We'll be filing a report noting that the call was made without sufficient evidence of danger." "I want more than a report," Deandra said, turning her attention to the officers fully now. "I want an investigation into whether this was an appropriate use of emergency services. My children, my babies, just had police show up at their door for no reason other than existing while black in an upscale hotel. My 8-year-old son is upstairs right now, probably terrified that his mother did something wrong, that we're going to be taken away from each other. Do you understand the psychological impact of that?" Officer Chin nodded slowly, her expression serious. "I do, Ms. Laurent. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to your family. We'll include all of this in our report, including the discrepancies in Ms. Walsh's timeline and the absence of any actual evidence of neglect." "Ms. Laurent," Tom Reynolds said, and his voice had taken on the careful quality of someone trying to defuse a bomb while being watched by spectators. "I cannot adequately express how sorry I am that this happened. This does not reflect the values of Grandview Properties or the standards we hold ourselves to. I will be conducting a full investigation." "You don't need to investigate," Deandra interrupted. "I just told you what happened. She racially profiled my family, made false accusations to police, and created a hostile environment for guests based on their race. The only question now is what consequences there will be." Rebecca made a small sound, something between a sob and a protest, but Deandra wasn't finished with the accounting that needed to happen here. "Pull the security footage for the past 6 weeks, Deandra said, looking at Tom. "Every interaction Rebecca has had with guests of color. Every time she's followed a black guest through the lobby or questioned their right to be here. Every microaggression, every raised eyebrow, every assumption of criminality or impropriety. I guarantee you'll find a pattern because this kind of racism doesn't appear overnight. It's been building, and your staff," she gestured to Portia at the front desk, who was trying very hard to look invisible, "your staff has seen it but felt powerless to speak up because she's their manager." Tom Reynolds turned to look at Portia, who met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before her eyes welled with tears and she nodded once, confirmation and apology and relief all mixed together in that single gesture. "There have been complaints," Portia said softly, finding her courage now that someone had finally said the quiet part loud. "From guests, from staff. Mr. and Mrs. Chen from San Francisco, the tech executives who checked out early last month. They mentioned uncomfortable interactions with management. The Johnson family left a negative review specifically mentioning feeling unwelcome. Dante in housekeeping transferred to another property because he said Ms. Walsh made comments about his hair and his professionalism. We've been losing staff and guests and we knew why, but she's your superior, and you were afraid of retaliation," Deandra finished. "I understand. That's why I've been here observing. That's why I wanted to see how operations ran when people didn't know I was watching. Skylark appeared at Deandra's side then, having come back downstairs with Temperance in tow, and both young women looked at their mother with expressions that contained multitudes, pride and anger and hurt and love all tangled together. Behind them, Quentin and little August emerged from the elevator, escorted by a security guard who looked deeply uncomfortable about the situation he'd been dragged into. "Mama," August said in that small voice that 8-year-olds use when they're scared and trying not to show it, "are we in trouble?" The man in the uniform came to our door and asked if we were okay and where you were, and I didn't know what to say. Deandra's composure, which had held through police questioning and confrontation and revelation, finally cracked. She knelt down to August's level, pulling him into a hug that was as much for her as it was for him, feeling the solid warmth of her youngest child and thinking about how close she'd come to having him taken from her, even temporarily, because someone looked at her family and saw a problem instead of people. "You're not in trouble, baby," she said into his hair. "You did nothing wrong. None of you did anything wrong. This is about grown-ups making mistakes and we're going to fix it." "The lady was mean," August said, his voice muffled against Deandra's shoulder. "She came over last week when we were in the lobby, and she asked Quentin why he was hanging around, and if he was supposed to be here. She made him feel bad." Deandra pulled back to look at Quentin, who shrugged with that affected teenage indifference that didn't quite hide the hurt beneath it. "It wasn't a big deal," he mumbled. "It was a big deal," Skylark contradicted firmly, her voice carrying the sharp edge of protective older sister fury. "It was a huge deal and we didn't tell you because we didn't want to add to your stress, but she's been awful. She follows us with her eyes whenever we're in public spaces. She made a comment to Temperance about dress codes when she was wearing perfectly appropriate clothes. She asked me last month if I was really staying in the penthouse or if I was visiting someone, like she couldn't imagine we actually belonged there." Deandra stood slowly, and when she turned back to Rebecca Walsh, her expression had transmuted into something beyond anger, beyond hurt, into the cold clarity of someone who has seen the full extent of harm done and is prepared to address it comprehensively. "You didn't just call the police on me," Deandra said softly. "You've been terrorizing my children for weeks. You've been making them feel unwelcome in their own home, questioned their right to exist in spaces they have every right to occupy, subjected them to surveillance and suspicion solely because of the color of their skin. My children, who have done nothing but be respectful, courteous, excellent young people, have been living under the weight of your racism." "Ms. Laurent," Tom Reynolds began, but Deandra held up a hand. "I'm not done. Rebecca Walsh, you are terminated effective immediately. You will not return to this property, you will not access hotel systems, you will not contact any staff or guests. Tom will escort you to collect your personal belongings under supervision, and you will sign whatever separation paperwork HR prepares. You will not receive severance beyond what is legally mandated, and the reason for termination will be documented as gross misconduct and violation of company anti-discrimination policies." Rebecca's face had gone from white to gray, the reality of unemployment and professional disgrace settling over her like ash. "You can't. This is unfair. I was just doing my job." "Your job," Deandra said, and there was no mercy in her voice now, no softness, "was to manage a luxury hotel that serves diverse clientele with professionalism and respect. Your job was to create an environment where all guests feel welcome and valued. Your job was to handle situations with discretion and good judgment. You failed spectacularly at all of those things. You racially profiled guests, made false reports to police, endangered children by involving CPS unnecessarily, and created a hostile environment that has cost this hotel both employees and revenue. You didn't do your job, Rebecca. You did the opposite of your job." Officer Chen was taking detailed notes now, her report was going to be extensive, and Officer Bradford was nodding slowly with the expression of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended, with lawsuits and settlements and careers destroyed by prejudice that finally found consequences. "We're going to leave now," Officer Chen said, addressing Deandra directly. "Again, I'm very sorry your family was subjected to this. If you choose to file a formal complaint about the inappropriate use of emergency services, the department will take it seriously. And Ms. Walsh," she turned to Rebecca with an expression that was professionally neutral but carried an undercurrent of contempt, "filing false reports is a crime. Consider yourself fortunate that Ms. Laurent seems more interested in holding you accountable through employment consequences than through criminal charges." After the officers left, the lobby was thick with tension and the weight of phones still recording, of guests who had witnessed the entire confrontation and would be posting about it on social media within minutes, of staff members who were seeing their manager fired in real time and processing what that meant for the culture they'd been working in. Tom Reynolds was pale but functioning in crisis management mode, already mentally drafting the statements he'd need to make to the board, the press releases that would be required, the emergency staff meetings to address what had just happened. "Ms. Laurent," he said carefully, "what else can I do to begin making this right?" Deandra looked around the lobby, at her 4 children clustered together, processing trauma they shouldn't have had to experience, at the staff members who were watching with expressions ranging from shock to validation to fear about their own futures, at the guests who had witnessed a black family being questioned and humiliated in public, at the marble and crystal and luxury that was supposed to represent excellence but had instead become a stage for discrimination. "We're going to have an all-staff meeting tomorrow," Deandra said. "Every single employee from housekeeping to senior management. I'm going to introduce myself properly, explain what happened here today, and announce a complete overhaul of our anti-discrimination policies and training procedures. We're going to bring in external consultants to audit our practices and train staff on implicit bias. We're going to implement anonymous reporting systems for discrimination complaints. And we're going to make it crystal clear that racist behavior has consequences at every level of this organization." "Of course," Tom said, nodding vigorously. "Whatever you need. I'll begin organizing immediately." "And Tom?" Deandra's voice softened slightly, not with forgiveness but with the recognition of someone who'd been trying to do right in a system that made it difficult. "I need you to think very carefully about how Rebecca was able to operate like this for 6 weeks without anyone feeling empowered to stop her. That's a structural problem, not just an individual one. We need to fix the culture that allowed this to happen, not just punish one person who took it too far." What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV for more powerful black stories. The video went viral within hours. Multiple guests had recorded the confrontation, and while some of the footage was shaky or captured only portions of the encounter, together they told a complete story of racial profiling, power revelation, and consequence. By nightfall, #Grandview Hotel owner was trending on multiple platforms, the story picked up by local news and then national outlets, the narrative of a wealthy black woman being racially profiled in her own hotel too perfect for the news cycle to ignore. The response was complicated, as these things always are. There were people celebrating Deandra's triumph, applauding her calm handling of a situation designed to strip her of dignity. There were people questioning why she kept her ownership quiet in the first place, as if observing how your business treats people when they don't know you're watching was somehow suspicious. There were, inevitably, people defending Rebecca Walsh, claiming she'd just been trying to protect children and shouldn't be punished for caring about child safety, completely missing or deliberately ignoring the racial dynamics that had motivated the initial call. But mostly, the video resonated with millions of black people who'd experienced their own versions of this story, being questioned in spaces they had every right to occupy, being followed in stores, being asked if they were sure they belonged, being subjected to police intervention for simply existing while black. The video became a touchstone, a moment where the invisible made visible, where the power dynamic reversed, where for once the person doing the profiling faced immediate and dramatic consequences. The legal fallout was swift. 3 other former guests came forward with their own experiences of being racially profiled at the Grandview Imperial during Rebecca Walsh's brief tenure, their complaints corroborated by staff testimony and security footage. 2 current employees filed formal complaints about Rebecca's treatment of them, one describing how she'd been written up for unprofessional appearance, despite her hair meeting all company standards, another detailing how Rebecca had questioned whether he was really a registered guest or just hanging around the lobby. The hotel's parent company, in which Deandra held controlling interest, moved quickly to contain the damage. They issued a public apology, not the mealy-mouthed "sorry you were offended" variety but a genuine acknowledgement of systemic failure. They announced the comprehensive policy changes Deandra had demanded. They created a scholarship fund for hospitality students of color. They did what corporations do when they've been caught failing spectacularly and need to prove they're taking it seriously. And they offered Deandra a settlement, $3 million to compensate for the distress, humiliation, and trauma inflicted on her family, to avoid a lawsuit that would be both expensive and damaging to the brand, to make a statement that such behavior carried steep financial consequences. Deandra took the settlement, but she didn't keep it. Instead, she donated the entire amount to 3 organizations: a legal defense fund that represented families wrongly targeted by Child Protective Services, a national organization fighting racial profiling in public accommodations, and a scholarship program supporting black students pursuing careers in hospitality management. The donation made headlines of its own, the gesture of refusing to personally profit from racial trauma while ensuring the money would help prevent others from experiencing the same. 1 month later, the Grandview Imperial held a gala that had been planned long before the incident, originally conceived as a quiet celebration of the property's anniversary but transformed into something much more significant: the public introduction of Deandra Laurent as owner, a statement about the hotel's commitment to change, and a fundraiser for the organizations she donated the settlement to. The ballroom was packed, a mix of industry leaders, local politicians, journalists, and community activists, the guest list carefully curated to represent the diversity that the Grandview Imperial aspired to serve. The staff was different now too, not just because Rebecca was gone but because the entire culture had begun shifting, the mandatory training sessions and policy changes creating space for conversations that had been suppressed before, empowering people to speak up about problems they'd previously suffered in silence. Deandra stood at the podium in a midnight blue gown that managed to be both elegant and commanding, her locks swept up in an intricate style, her 4 children seated in the front row watching their mother with the kind of fierce pride that teenagers rarely show their parents. Thaddeus was there too, sitting beside his children in a show of family unity that said more than any speech could about how they'd rallied together in the aftermath of trauma. 3 months ago, Deandra began, her voice carrying clearly through the space, I moved my family into the penthouse suite of this hotel as part of a quiet observation period during our ownership transition. I wanted to see how the Grandview Imperial really operated when people didn't know I was watching. I wanted to understand what guests experienced, what staff dealt with, where our systems worked and where they failed. She paused, let the silence stretch just long enough to be meaningful. What I learned was more painful than I expected. I learned that even in a luxury hotel that prides itself on excellence, racism can flourish unchecked. I learned that my children, brilliant, kind, accomplished young people, could be made to feel like intruders in their own home because of the color of their skin. I learned that a single person with prejudice and power can poison an entire environment, and that good people often stay silent not because they agree but because they're afraid of the consequences of speaking up. The audience was completely still, the only sound the quiet click of journalists' keyboards and the soft whir of cameras. But I also learned something else. I learned that systems can change, that consequences matter, that making invisible dynamics visible, even when it's painful, even when it's public, is necessary for transformation. What happened to my family was traumatic, but it revealed problems that were always there, hurting people who didn't have the resources or platforms to fight back. Deandra gestured to the screen behind her, where photos appeared, the new staff hired in the past month, a diverse group of professionals at every level from housekeeping to management. Images from the anti-bias training sessions, screenshots of the new anonymous reporting system, headlines about the policy changes rippling through the entire hotel chain. This is what accountability looks like, she said. Not just firing one person who got caught, but examining the systems that allowed that behavior to flourish. Not just making corporate statements, but implementing concrete changes with measurable outcomes. Not just talking about diversity, but actually creating environments where everyone can thrive regardless of their race, background, or identity. She looked directly at her children, her voice softening just slightly. My babies shouldn't have had to experience what they experienced. No family should. But since it happened, we're going to make sure something good comes from it. The $3 million settlement from this incident is being donated to organizations fighting for families, fighting against profiling, fighting to create opportunities in industries that have historically excluded people who look like us. That money will fund legal defenses, education, advocacy. It will help prevent other families from experiencing what we did. The applause started then, swelling through the ballroom, but Deandra raised her hand gently to quiet it because she wasn't finished. Change is hard. Real change, systemic change, is uncomfortable and ongoing and never really complete. We're going to make mistakes as we rebuild the culture here. We're going to have difficult conversations. We're going to discover problems we didn't know existed. But we're committed to doing this work, and we're committed to being a model for what hospitality can look like when it truly welcomes everyone. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. The Grandview Imperial and all our properties are places of luxury, yes, but they should also be places of dignity. Every guest, regardless of their race, should feel not just tolerated but celebrated. Every staff member should feel empowered to call out injustice without fear of retaliation. Every child should be able to exist without being viewed as a threat. That's the standard we're holding ourselves to, and I invite you all to hold us accountable to it. The applause this time was thunderous, people rising to their feet, and Deandra stepped back from the podium, her public responsibility discharged, ready to simply be a mother again. Later, when the formal program had ended and the gala had shifted into mingling and conversations, Deandra found herself on the balcony overlooking the Atlantic, the November wind sharp but refreshing after the warmth of the crowded ballroom. Skylark joined her, bringing 2 glasses of sparkling cider and that particular expression that meant she had something important to say. "You know," Skylark said, leaning against the railing beside her mother, "when you first told us we were moving into a hotel for a few months, I thought it was going to be this glamorous adventure. Room service whenever we wanted, a pool, living like we were on permanent vacation. But it wasn't," Deandra said quietly. "No," Skylark agreed. "It was education. It was seeing how people treat us differently when they think we don't have power. It was watching you handle something horrible with grace and strength. It was learning that being black in America means constantly having to prove you belong, even in spaces you literally own." She turned to look at her mother directly, and there were tears in her eyes but also something fierce and unbreakable. "But it was also learning that we don't have to accept that we can demand better, that our dignity matters, that speaking up, even when it's scary, even when it's public, is how things change. You showed us that, Mom. And my college essay is going to be amazing because of it." Deandra laughed, the sound catching slightly in her throat, and pulled her daughter into a hug. "I'm sorry you had to learn those lessons so young," she said. "I'm sorry any of you did." "I'm not," Skylark said firmly. "I mean, I wish it hadn't happened that way. I wish Rebecca Walsh hadn't been a racist who called the cops on us. But I'm not sorry I know now what I'm capable of handling. I'm not sorry I saw you stand up for us. I'm not sorry I learned that justice sometimes actually happens, even if you have to fight for it." Inside the ballroom, Deandra could see her other children, Temperance talking animatedly with a group of college students who'd received scholarships from one of the organizations she donated to, Quentin demonstrating his crossover dribble to a former NBA player who was one of the gala sponsors, August sitting on Thaddeus's lap and falling asleep despite the noise and the lights and the celebration happening around them. Her family. Her babies. Growing up in a world that would challenge them, question them, sometimes try to break them, but hopefully also a world that was changing, slowly, because people refused to accept the way things had always been. "You know what the hardest part is?" Deandra said, still watching her children through the glass. "Knowing that we got justice because I had resources and power. Because I owned the hotel and could fire the person who hurt us. Because I could hire lawyers and donate money and make headlines. But there are thousands of families this happens to who don't have those resources, who suffer the same profiling and humiliation without any recourse, without any consequence for the people who hurt them." "I know," Skylark said. "That's why what you're doing matters. The policy changes, the donations, the public stand, it's not just about us. It's about the next black family who stays here, and the one after that, and all the people who'll never know your name but will benefit from the systems you changed." Deandra thought about Rebecca Walsh, who disappeared from public view after her termination, who would carry this incident as a permanent mark on her career, who might never understand that the problem wasn't that she'd been caught but that she'd done it in the first place. She thought about all the Rebecca Walshes in the world, operating in businesses and institutions and systems, making life harder for people who'd done nothing except be black in spaces where others thought they didn't belong. And she thought about her children, who would grow up knowing they didn't have to accept that treatment, who would carry forward the lesson that dignity was non-negotiable, that justice was possible even if you had to fight for it, that sometimes the people underestimating you gave you the opportunity to reveal exactly who you were and what you could do. The settlement would help dozens of families. The policy changes would protect countless guests and employees. The public nature of the incident would make at least some people think twice before giving in to their racist assumptions. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was something, and something was better than silence, better than suffering in private, better than accepting discrimination as the price of existing. "Come on," Deandra said, squeezing her daughter's shoulder. "Let's go back inside. I think August's about ready to go home, and I promised him pancakes for breakfast tomorrow." "In our hotel?" Skylark asked with a slight smile. "In our home," Deandra corrected. "Which happens to be in our hotel. There's a difference." And there was. The penthouse suite that had been a temporary observation post was now simply home, the place where her family lived and belonged, not because they'd proven themselves worthy of occupying it but because they'd owned it all along, because their right to be there had never been in question except in the mind of someone whose prejudice had finally met consequence. They walked back inside together, mother and daughter, to collect the rest of their family and go upstairs to the place that was theirs by right, by ownership, and by the simple fact that they existed and belonged anywhere they chose to be. The Grandview Imperial would go on, under new leadership and with new policies, serving guests who would never know the full story of what had happened in its lobby that Thursday afternoon in November. But the people who'd been there, the staff who'd witnessed it, the guests who'd recorded it, the millions who'd watched the videos online, they would remember. They would remember that sometimes justice happens. That sometimes power reveals itself at exactly the right moment. That sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to own the whole building, and your prejudice becomes your downfall. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would think twice before making assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, before calling authorities on families who've done nothing wrong, before letting their racism dictate their actions. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And sometimes, something is how change begins. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. If Bold Black Watch TV moved you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us amplify Black stories about justice that deserve to be heard.